I've watched a bunch of films recently in the world of fairy tale and folk horror, and they've all been incredible. The Green Snake, coolest film I've ever seen. Tale of Tales, coolest film I've ever seen. The Company of Wolves, coolest film I've ever seen. But it got me thinking about how few and far between films in this genre really are. They're remarkably absent from contemporary culture, and as one of our main sources of storytelling, cinema plays a huge part in that absence. In particular, why we've seen somewhat of a death of the fairy tale in the modern age. Over the last 70 years or so, there have been a few fairy tale films such as Donkey Skin, Princess Bride and The Red Shoes that have been applauded by critics and audiences alike, solidifying their place in film history. And we've had a few more recent attempts like Terry Gilliam's The Brothers Grimm, Into the Woods, Jack the Giant Slayer, Red Riding Hood, Mirror Mirror, Gretel and Hansel and Tale of Tales. But the vast majority of fairy tale films we've had in the last 20 years have either been ill-adapted rubbish or overlooked for their merits. I also just want to note in this video that I won't be talking about folk, as I have an upcoming video on folk horror. And one heavy hitter that I won't be talking about in this video is Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth. This is my favourite film of all time, and while I do consider it to be a fairy tale in some respects, I wouldn't consider it to be the predominant genre of this film. For the sake of this video, when I say fairy tale film, I'm really sticking to films directly based on traditional fairy stories or original stories adjacent to them. As much as they might have been inspired in plot or that we sometimes incorrectly associate them with pre-1800s lore, we're not getting into our Alice in Wonderland's, Beastly's Freeways or Wizard of Oz's. While you'll find a decent amount of fairy tale films made in almost every decade since the birth of cinema, they haven't seen a boom like superhero movies, science fiction, or high fantasy. And it's been a long time since we've had a fairy tale film that's been unanimously praised or become part of contemporary culture in a meaningful way. So why is it that it's been so long since an on-screen fairy tale has carved itself a place in cinematic history? And why are there so few in comparison to other genres that even try? What is a fairy tale? That was serving slam poetry realness.
Waving my hands a lot!
What a fairy tale actually is surprisingly difficult to define. They belong in the same camp as folklore and legend, stories passed down through cultures and societies for centuries or more. And the more you think about what could be considered a fairy tale, the broader it seems to get. But I would boil down the question to two answers. It describes both an aesthetic wrapping and a style of storytelling. From gothic tales to whimsical children's stories, the iconography is pretty defined. They're often set outside of reality in magical worlds, with recurrent elements like princesses, knights, goblins, witches, fairies, dragons, castles, and forests. The Middle Ages and post-medieval period have become synonymous with the on-screen fairy tale aesthetic. But the short of it is, we don't know when many fairy stories actually originated or how they were told when people relied on oral tradition. Every bone in my body is resisting making a joke about oral tradition. Every bone. What we can see is that we pretty much cut their aesthetic ties with the modern world when they began to be collected or rewritten by the likes of Charles Perrault, Hans Christian Andersen, and the Grimm brothers between the 16 and 1800s. You don't see telephones or other marks of modernity in traditional fairy tales because they were invented after we had established versions of those stories in print. In a sense, those stories, or at least their settings, stopped evolving here. It's these character archetypes and historic periods that combined establish our understanding of what fairy tale otherworlds look like. But these aesthetic elements can be applied to any kind of story. When it comes to on-screen fairy tales, there are films like Shrek, Ella Enchanted, and other Enchanted that have the aesthetic qualities of fairy tales, but they're undoubtedly 2000s kids comedy movies and rom-coms in tone. And that's not knocking them. They can be amazing films, and it would also be silly of me to say that I wouldn't consider them fairy tales at all. But they don't have the feeling that reading a Hans Christian Andersen story will give you. To me, the true heart of a fairy tale comes down to what kind of story it is. The Oxford Languages definition interestingly refers to them as tales intended to deceive. And I think that's quite significant. There is an innate level of trickery in fairy tales, as many of them were conceived to scare people. The stories survived and were passed down because they were warnings. Cultures needed them to keep people both alive and in line. These kinds of fairy tales tell us not to misbehave, not to reject tradition, not to leave home, to know your place. They're not the light-hearted, love-yourself stories we tell today about self-discovery and success. There are, of course, fairy stories that aren't all misery, as the tales were also told to inspire goodness in people and serve as a reminder that being pure of heart is more important than wealth, beauty, or power. Across the vast collection of fairy stories we have culturally, it's interesting to see where the tales of unpleasantries and the tales of inspiring morality intersect. Cinderella or Ashputtel, for instance, is one where our fairy princess gets her happy ending. Her sisters, however, aren't so lucky, having their heels and toes cut off in the original story. Fairy tales combine one or both of these two core elements. And if we're fighting over how to define them, I personally think the films that encompass both the visual and thematic elements are the most fairy tale of the fairy tale films. So, what is it about fairy tales that don't translate to screen for a modern general audience? Two recurring elements of fairy tales is that they are simple and they are dreadful. And I think both play a part in them falling out of favour. Matteo Garon's Tale of Tales is made up of stories from a collection of 17th century Italian fairy tales titled Lo Canto degli Canti. I'm almost certainly not saying that right, and based on YouTube's language policies, I'm not sure I can say it at all. Garon said that he chose these stories specifically because they related to modern issues of plastic surgery, the frenzied desire to have a child, the conflict between generations, and the painful passage from adolescence to adulthood. Each a story of obsession creating unhappiness. But even with the intention of putting stories with contemporary messages to screen, the film sadly didn't resonate with a lot of people. With a 56% Rotten Tomatoes audience score and a 3.3 rating on Letterboxd, the main complaints being that the stories felt unresolved or pointless. And I think this is because, on a whole, we don't really like the structure of fairy tales. Partly down to misery, people not getting their happy endings, turning to sea foam, for instance, or being robbed and hung from a tree, being deemed unsatisfying. And partly because modern cinema has developed our expectations of structures, pace, and character arcs, leaving many traditional folk or fairy stories unable to fulfill those expectations. 1970s Donkey Skin, based on Charles Perrault's 1695 tale, is an interesting case. Because if it were made today, I can't imagine it being that well received. Yet, it's beloved. Having been well received by critics and audiences at the time, and maintaining a 76% score on Rotten Tomatoes and a 3.9 on Letterboxd. And I loved it too. It's gorgeous and ridiculous, but I have to be honest, the story is rubbish and it left me giggling in confusion when it finally came to a halt. I feel like a huge part of the adoration of Donkey Skin is old movie prestige bias, but this is not the video for that conversation. It's very comparable to Tale of Tales. Beautiful looking, whimsical, and weird. But as a modern film, when Tale of Tales was released in 2014, it was met by an audience with an evolved set of expectations, evolved even from the 1970s, leaving it somewhat damned from the start. Tale of Tales is an exception in the world of contemporary fairy tale films in that it takes itself entirely seriously. But many of the other new entries into the genre aren't good because they're afraid to take themselves seriously and not sell, which leaves us with a bunch of cheap and silly interpretations. I don't like focusing on movies that I think are bad because in general, I'd rather uplift the things that I do enjoy. But I think it is important to spotlight some of the failures, both critically and financially, that might have contributed to the slow death of the fairy tale. Topping the category of failed recent attempts, I'd put 2011's Red Riding Hood and 2013's Jack the Giant Slayer. I did actually go see Red Riding Hood at the cinema when I was in high school, and I also loved it, but that is my cross to bear. As clear attempts to draw in school holiday audiences with sexy 20-something leads, cringy contemporary dialogue,
It's Jack!
and loads of dumb fighting, these films lack the spirit of the fairy stories they're based on. They feel tacky and empty, too focused on keeping people entertained with scares, giggles, bright colors, and battles, rather than just having good screenwriting. Red Riding Hood takes itself a bit more seriously than The Giant Slayer, but it still has an old pop rock soundtrack, a sexy dance scene, and everyone's wearing eyeliner for the entire runtime. At this point, you're basically watching any random 2000s high school drama, just at some point someone's dad got eaten by a wolf. And then, of course, there's Disney. But do these films actually echo the sentiment of fairy tales in any meaningful way? I would argue no, and that's hardly a controversial opinion. It's probably not news to you that much of what we associate with fairy tales comes from the aesthetic applied by Disney. And that's not a problem. But Disneyfied fairy stories have already been stripped of so many of the traditional atrocities, and the most recent round of Disney remakes has further polished them via capitalist intent to such flat and shiny films that they don't resemble their predecessors at all. 2005's The Brothers Grimm is a film that I am sad to include here in my list of failures. Because while many of its elements make my skin crawl and my mouth salivate in all the right ways, it's brought down drastically by a flimsy plot, goofy humor, and unnecessary love triangle. I think I'm not alone in being someone who loves this movie in theory and is let down by the reality of watching it. I still love it, and I know it's terrible. Thus, the duality of film criticism. One of the more successful recent fairy tale attempts was Snow White and the Huntsman, which doesn't have brilliant reviews but made $396.6 million and even got a sequel. I think a lot of its box office draw was that it pushed pretty hard into adult, high fantasy action territory, clearly pulling influence from the prowess of Lord of the Rings and possibly even Game of Thrones, which came out the year before. And the sort of darkness this film exudes is totally giving fairy tale realness. But it still prioritizes being a blockbuster, and therefore ultimately falls a little flat. Moving to greener territories, 1998's Ever After is probably one of the best recent fairy tale films. And one of the reasons it was so well received is because of how successfully it combined the story of Cinderella with the beats of a 90s romance movie. It's Drew Barrymore, a few flirty jokes, and plenty of dialogue reminding us that it's the 90s and girls rule. But it works. And when I was rewatching clips of it for this video, it made me cry. It has a warmth and an earnestness. By comparison to the films that came after it, it's practically a Scorsese-level drama. Also, I'm going to be real with you, I have not seen Stardust, but my understanding is that it falls into a similar space. While it uses modern beats, it's a film that has a reverence for traditional stories. And have we had any totally modern fairy tales, not just made, but set in the 2000s? Well, I'm about to tell you. Also, I'm supposed to be referencing like a sort of Prince Charming thing, but I keep seeing myself in the viewfinder and I look like Chairman Mao. I mentioned before that in the 1800s, fairy tales somewhat stopped evolving. But of course it isn't quite that simple. Needless to say, fairy stories have evolved. But once we set something entirely in our modern world, we don't really think of the stories as fairy tales anymore. There's also the fact that the themes and messages that were relevant in the past are no longer relevant in today's society. Jump scare. Sorry, I don't have my mic with me, but I really wanted to clarify what I mean here. I'm not saying that the themes aren't still relevant for their metaphorical value, because they are, but that many of these stories were warnings against specific issues that we don't face. Little Red Riding Hood warned us not to go into the woods on the very literal basis that the woods were dangerous and you could get mauled or lost. These days, that story is often used as a warning about creepy men and stranger danger. This metaphorical value is still relevant, but that's the modern meaning that we have applied. I'm actually about to show some clips from Hard Candy, which absolutely makes nods to Red Riding Hood, but the relevant story is about online grooming. I also use a Slenderman clip, which is in simple terms a don't go into the woods story, but it's really more to do with being vulnerable to internet conspiracies and fable. What's no longer relevant is worrying that little Timmy has literally wandered off the path in the forest and will never find his way home. New generations have their own fables and folklore, everything from Click Click Slide to Slenderman, and some of those will be made into movies, unfortunately. But at a certain point, they stop resembling fairy stories, both aesthetically and thematically. And don't get me wrong, if you wanted to draw a parallel between really any film and a fairy tale and call it a modern fairy tale interpretation, you could. Megan is basically just Pinocchio, and 50 Shades of Grey is just Beauty and the Beast with a less attractive leading man. But it's rare for us to get a contemporary film that really encapsulates the feelings that fairy stories of old give. A Cure for Wellness is one of the few films that I'd confidently call an entirely modern fairy tale. It starts in a cubicled office building, and among its contemporary themes and settings features a cell phone, a laptop, and MAC lipstick, but it still manages to maintain the sentiment of a fairy tale. It leans into some of the more unpleasant aspects of fairy tales that films often avoid, such as good old-fashioned incest, and actually takes itself seriously, not feeling the need to throw in constant zingers to convince the audience that it's doing its job of entertaining you. It's directed by Gore Verbinski, and I see him as a director who clearly has insane vision, but hasn't been given the opportunities to go wild with it. You see his brilliance in moments of the Pirates films. You see it in the videotape in The Ring. Here, Verbinski finally gets to go full hog, which is something many directors never get the opportunity to do, but the result just didn't do it for most people. Full hog. Full, delicious hog. As I've already said, this is a film that I adore, and in many ways, I can't really see what it is that other people don't like about it. However, a quick scroll through the box tells me that many people found it to be confusing, self-indulgent, style over substance, boring, and way too long. But what do people on Letterboxd know? I saw someone the other day say that Dune 2 was the best science fiction film that had ever been made. And that person clearly hasn't seen Attack of the Clones. I'm kind of kidding, but I'm kind of not. For all of its sincerity, A Cure for Wellness was met with most of the same criticisms as Tale of Tales, which further solidifies for me that it's not the aesthetic of fairy tales that we are turning away from, but the stories themselves. The language of film has evolved so much that a film like Cure for Wellness is no longer enough. Even with an original story, emotional through line, strong character motivations, a beautiful setting, great direction, and good acting. Yet still, it's not clear-cut enough. It's not entertaining enough. It's not concise enough. It's not enough. What's bizarre is that fairy tales, both scary and shiny, are such a huge part of childhood, and it's like we don't know how to carry that into our adulthood. There is this innate understanding we have of magic as children, of melancholy and even morality. As children, we're without the level of self-consciousness that prevents us from being truly earnest as we grow older. As far as I see it, great fairy tale films require a sense of whimsy and seriousness that isn't compatible with modern cinema. Not many films these days do take themselves seriously, unless they're straight dramas. Humor is injected into everything because it's an easy distraction, and thanks to the success of Deadpool in particular, cinema on a whole has been flooded with ironic self-awareness that excuses tropes and tries to get ahead of its audience's criticisms left, right, and center. Marketability also has a very significant effect on which movies actually get made, with high-budget productions needing to be transformed into toys and brand deals. Verily Bitchy, I hope I'm saying that right, has a great video about how Harry Potter was actually primed for commercial success, as the studio recognized its endless potential to sell stuff to kids. Getting a film made when it doesn't have that potential can be near impossible, and creating the visually stunning and elaborate worlds we hope to see in on-screen fairy tales requires pretty big financial backing. While fairy tale films really speak to some people, sadly, there's no real desire for them from general audiences. Not in numbers that make a difference, and unfortunately, it's the numbers that speak to studio heads. Fairy tales don't belong in our world, and that's what makes them so special, but it also means they haven't been granted a place in modern culture, and ultimately, it could see this style of storytelling dying out. As many of you probably do too, I wish this wasn't the way. I wish we saw more films like Tale of Tales, A Company of Wolves, A Cure for Wellness, or Ever After. Films not afraid to be earnest. Films that embraced traditional fairy tale sensibilities. And I wish those movies got their flowers. It seems the fairy tale didn't get its own happily ever after, a notion as saddening as it is fitting. I've got widgets and bibbits and bobbits. Can you guess who I am?